Okay, so now let's move on to section 6 of chapter 9. Like I mentioned in the previous one, we're not going to cover the rest of section 5 up here, so you don't have to worry about like a muscle twitch or graded muscle contractions, muscle tone, isotonic or isometric contractions. We never have time to come back to it, even though I have it here in the slides. So now we're going to move on to 9.6 and talk a little bit about the energy that we get or acquire from muscle contraction. We talked about the role of ATP in cross-bridge cycling. We have to have ATP in order to remove the myosin head from the actin binding site to break that cross bridge. So ATP is the primary energy source when we talk about muscle contraction. I just mentioned that we need it in order to move and detach those cross bridges formed by the head and the G-actin subunit. We also need ATP in order to pump calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum once muscle contractions completed so that we don't continue to undergo cross bridge cycling. We also need ATP to pump sodium out and potassium back into the cell, so that sodium potassium pump is active transport, so it does require ATP. However, our body, our skeletal muscle cells, we don't really store ATP, so the amount of ATP that's readily available during muscle contraction can be depleted in about 4 to 6 seconds. So we have to regenerate the ATP, especially if we're undergoing like some vigorous sort of exercise. Um, and ATP is the only source. There's other forms of energy like GTP, but ATP is the only one that we can actually use for muscle contraction. And so we have to have the ability to regenerate it. So there's a couple different ways that we can regenerate it depending on the environment of the cell. So we have direct phosphorylation of ADP into ATP by creatine phosphate or CP. We have an anaerobic pathway, and then we have an aerobic pathway. So let's talk first about direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate. We have creatine phosphate in our muscle cells just like we do ATP. And what's going to happen is as soon as we deplete the stores of ATP that we have in the cell, we're going to have an enzyme called creatine kinase come in and take the phosphate from creatine phosphate, attach it to ADP, adenine diphosphate, so that we get ATP, adenine triphosphate. So we've added that additional phosphate to it. If we don't have creatine kinase in order to do this, then we can't use this source of phosphate to generate ATP. Once we take that phosphate from ADP and get ATP, then we're just left with creatine alone. So a lot of people who work out, they take creatine. A lot of times they'll take creatine before a workout or creatine after a workout. And again, the whole purpose of the creatine is that it contains a phosphate so that we can regenerate ATP quickly. We can regenerate ATP quickly if we take creatine phosphate in the event, if we take it ahead of a workout, during our workout, or we have to replenish ATP stores after we finish our workout. So we can also use creatine phosphate to replenish the ATP stores that way as well. So again, we don't have a whole lot of ATP, so that's readily used, especially during exercise. So then after we run out of the ATP stores that we have, we take the phosphate from creatine and make some more ATP. But even the ATP stores that we do have in the cell and the creatine phosphate, we only really have enough ATP to power a cell for about 15 seconds. So anything that requires muscle contraction beyond 15 seconds, we have to move on and find a different way to regenerate ATP because we cannot replenish it until we're actually at rest. So here's just an illustration of direct phosphorylation of ADP via creatine phosphate. Here's our enzyme creatine kinase. Anytime you see kinase, that means that it's an enzyme that's going to phosphorylate something. So creatine kinase comes in, takes the phosphate from creatine, attaches it to ADP so that we get ATP, and now we're just left for creatine. Downside is we can only generate one ATP molecule per creatine phosphate because creatine phosphate only has one phosphate to donate. So we can't get a whole lot of energy. And again, we can't make more creatine phosphate until we're actually at rest. So if we're doing vigorous exercise for extended periods of time, we can no longer use creatine phosphate. We have to find another way. So one of the other pathways that we can use to make ATP is what's called an anaerobic pathway. That's going to be glycolysis and lactic acid formation. Lactic acid formation, which is a type of fermentation. So the anaerobic pathway, anaerobic just means it doesn't require oxygen, so no oxygen. However, it's not harmed by the presence of oxygen. So it doesn't only occur in the absence of oxygen, it occurs in both the absence of oxygen and the presence of oxygen. And this pathway is basically going to be what's called glycolysis. And glycolysis is the first step in glucose catabolism. And if you remember from the, I believe, chemistry section, catabolism is going to be the breaking down of something. So we take glucose and we are going to break glucose down into two pyruvic acid molecules. And when we do this, we'll talk about the fate of pyruvic acid in a second. But during this breakdown or catabolism of glucose into pyruvic acid, we generate 2 ATP. This is actually the net ATP produced because we do have an energy investment phase where we have to invest 2 ATP. We produce 4 ATP from glycolysis. So the net production of ATP is 2 ATP. So 2 ATP is not a lot of ATP in the realm of the amount of ATP that our skeletal muscle cells use. But however, we can still get a little bit just from glycolysis itself. And again, if we don't have any oxygen available, so this happens sometimes in our skeletal muscle, we get low oxygen levels, then we can't move on to aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen because we have such low oxygen. So normally that pyruvic acid that we just created by lysing or splitting glucose basically in half would enter the mitochondria and undergo aerobic respiration. But during high intensity activity or activity that lasts for an extended period of time, we're not going to have any oxygen available. Why don't we have oxygen available? Because as our muscles, bulging muscles, expand, they're going to compress on the blood vessels. Well, the blood vessels are the ones carrying the blood, which is housing the oxygen needed for the tissue. So we're not getting enough oxygen. Muscle cells are one of the only cells in our body that can actually undergo lactic acid fermentation. So typically you think of fermentation, you think of yeast or some bacteria, but we actually can do it, but specifically only in our skeletal muscle cells. So in the absence of oxygen, we can undergo anaerobic glycolysis in skeletal muscle, where we actually take pyruvic acid and convert it to lactic acid. And that sometimes if you're exercising really hard and you get that burning feeling or the acidic feeling in your muscles, that means your muscles aren't getting enough oxygen and you're starting to build up lactic acid. So what happens to the lactic acid in the absence of oxygen? Well, it's going to diffuse out to your bloodstream. Our kidneys, livers, and our heart can use it as fuel. We can also take the lactic acid and convert it back to pyruvic acid or glucose in the liver if we want to do that too. So again, when we talk about anaerobic pathway and glycolysis and lactic acid formation, we only get about 2 ATP. So creatine phosphate, we only get 1 ATP per creatine phosphate that we have. When we talk about glycolysis, we only get, and then in the absence of oxygen, we only get 2 ATP. Still not a lot of ATP for the amount of glucose that we're actually using. So here's just an illustration. We have glucose, glycolysis, lysis means splitting, glyco, they're talking about a carbohydrate, in this case glucose. So we're splitting glucose into pyruvic acid. Also, another thing I want to point out is that occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. And then in the event that we do not have oxygen available, We take the pyruvic acid that we just made from splitting glucose in half and convert it into lactic acid, which is released in the blood, and they can go to our kidneys or liver or elsewhere to be used. We get about 2 ATP per glucose, and we also get lactic acid as a result. The amount of ATP produced from glycolysis or this anaerobic pathway can provide enough energy for about 30 to 40 seconds. So still not a whole lot because 2 ATP is not a significant amount. The major way that we can get ATP is via aerobic respiration, and this does require oxygen. So this is how we're going to produce about 95% of ATP if we're at rest or doing light to moderate exercise. So for example, just walking. It is a lot slower than the anaerobic pathway, but it provides so much more ATP that it's worth it. What does it consist of? A series of chemical reactions. These occur in the mitochondria. So again, we can have glycolysis just solely in the cytoplasm, but we have to have mitochondria in order to undergo aerobic respiration. It does require oxygen. I don't want to get into too many details on cellular respiration because you'll learn a lot more about it in AP2. It requires oxygen because the final step in aerobic respiration is the electron transport chain, and the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain is oxygen itself. So aerobic respiration is going to take your glucose, and basically the products of the glucose breakdown are carbon dioxide, we get water, and huge amounts of ATP. So from a single glucose molecule, if oxygen is available and we can undergo aerobic respiration, we can get 32 ATP produced. It's a rough estimate. Sometimes it could be 28. It could be up to 34. It really depends on a lot of different factors. But if we talked about anaerobic respiration in the absence of oxygen, we still broke that glucose down into pyruvic acid, but we only got 2 ATP from it. So the bulk and the best way to get ATP or energy for our cells is in the presence of oxygen and undergoing aerobic respiration. How do we do it? Again, aerobic respiration does include glycolysis. So we begin with glycolysis. And then we have something called a transitional phase or a preparatory reaction. And then we have citric acid cycle, formerly known as Krebs cycle. And then we have the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. So this entire thing is aerobic respiration. In the absence of oxygen, we can only undergo glycolysis. So if we have no oxygen, we only undergo glycolysis. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. These steps going forward, these require oxygen, and these occur in the mitochondria. So some big differences there. When we're talking about aerobic respiration, so this whole pathway, yes, we can use glucose because it does include glycolysis where we split glucose into pyruvic acid. How do we get that glucose? From glycogen that we have stored in the muscle fiber. We also have free glucose floating in our blood as well that we can use. We can also, this is telling you free fatty acids. They can enter in at different places within the citric acid cycle or glycolysis itself. And we can even use proteins. So amino acids can go in and they can also be used as a source of energy. If we're exercising beyond 30 minutes, typically we're going to be using fatty acids at that point because we've used all of our free blood glucose and our glycogen storage. So here's just, again, an illustration. We still have glycolysis as part of our aerobic respiration pathway. We're still breaking glucose down into pyruvic acid, but then we take, and again, this is happening in the cytoplasm, but then we can take our pyruvic acid if oxygen is available, and have it enter into the mitochondria, become something called acetyl CoA, go through a cycle called the citric acid cycle, then be transferred to the electron transport chain, undergo oxidative phosphorylation. Bottom line is the product of aerobic pathway is going to be to produce carbon dioxide, water, and most importantly, um, ATP, but a huge amount of ATP. Also shown here, we talked about the monomer for carbohydrate, specifically glucose entering. Fatty acids, so fats and amino acids, can also enter in at various points within aerobic respiration in order to produce ATP if we're low on glucose. Glucose is the preferred energy source or starting point or starting material for this pathway, but if we run out of glucose, we can use other things.